All right, well let's go ahead and get started here on some setup material because I got a bunch of little things to run through quickly. And last week we had a tremendous session. We had our mini symposium and coined our own new term, which is butt ramming, um, which is where you take a document and whether it likes it or not, you crank up its metrics simply by jamming a bunch of butts in there, and that's what ChatGPT will do for you if you can't do it yourself. Here's one kind of cool thing. One of the 10 most important books in the English language is regarded to be Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And look how the second half of the book begins with this paragraph. And there it is, plain and simple. And, but, therefore, ABT. It's always inspiring when you come across it just being in use, in just common parlance. Last week's mini symposium was tremendous. If you weren't here, it's on our Substack site. Maybe you could put the link in there, Matthew. 3-minute talks about the narrative metrics. So here's one little warm-up thing that I want to run through. I just did a blog post on this yesterday, and this is applying the metrics. There's an article that came out a couple days ago in the Atlantic about Barack Obama asking the question, where is Barack Obama? And I think it's a pretty good article. It's just saying why is he not playing a lead role in what's going on right now with the Democratic Party. But in the middle of it, it mentioned the speech that he gave at the Democratic National Convention last summer and referred to it as a showstopper. Well, I watched it, I think, and I don't remember it really stopping any shows, and it wasn't that monumental or memorable. So I question this at times, and what exactly is the criteria being used there? And as a matter of fact, Michelle Obama gave the speech right before him that led into him and introduced him. And so I was kind of curious using the narrative metrics, what sort of scores would we see for those two speeches if we analyze them? Here's first thing you see is that Michelle's speech was 2,200 words. The boss was 3,300 words, so that gave him more time. Her and frequency was not that impressive to start with, 3.4%. That's not disastrous, but that's just not what you see in tightly edited material. But he scored 3.7%. That's getting up towards 4%, which is the land of and downright boredom. More importantly, and to the point, her narrative index, the butt-to-and ratio, was a 15, which is decent. Most politicians give competent speeches score somewhere between 15 and 20, and Obama scored a 10. And I'm sorry, but most of his speeches are all under 20. They're kind of in the mid-teens or so, which are okay, but he just really wasn't a barn burner with the speeches that he gave. Which begs this question of a showstopper. But this is a little bit of the procedure that we were kind of getting into last week, which is how do you use these metrics? And they're not definitive, but they are a first kind of point of guidance. And as I say in the book over and over again, they're not very precise, but they're pretty accurate. And when you see scores like this, these are not particularly impressive speeches. And then this is the quantitative side of analyzing a speech for narrative structure. Then you dive into the qualitative side and take a look at just reading it and seeing how it feels in terms of the two fundamental tools, which are the ABT and the Dobzhansky. And there's nothing new about them. All they are is the age-old elements of plot and theme. ABT is the plot and Dobzhansky is the theme. So there's nothing new under the sun. All it is two tools that we've come up that have kind of made it more quantitative looking at that. And when you take a look at Obama's speech, here's one of the things you see that when you've been working with the ABT, as Matthew and I have been for intensely for 5 years, it just jumps out and grabs you. One of the things that happens with ABT in our workshops endlessly is the tendency to put the last 4 or 5 words of the whole ABT, the end of the green material, to end up there stating the overall context. And so I think this shows that we could change the whole world with this. And quite often that material is really stuff that ought to be at the very beginning to establish the context. And lo and behold, here's what you see at the end of Obama's speech, his last paragraph, his last major paragraph. He says, a restoration of what Lincoln called on the eve of war, our bonds of affection on America that taps into what he called the better angels of our nature. Look at the last line there. That's what this election is about. If that's what the election is about, why would you not open your speech with that very statement? And that's what he ought to have opened this speech with, to have a theme, to have a Dobzhansky, to have something that draws focus right at the very beginning. And this is how he could have opened his speech, with something along these lines of, you want to know what this election's about? It's what Abraham Lincoln on the eve of the Civil War called our bonds of affection. And what he meant by that was yada, yada, yada. You're establishing bonds of affection as your Dobzhansky, your theme that you can then message around. And more importantly, what this really illustrates is what our um, inspiration and guru from Silicon Valley, Christopher Lochhead, refers to as name it, frame it, and claim it. That's what you want to do. You want to set up something at the beginning, use that to frame your whole argument and claim it as your own and brand it as your speech. And you end up it could have been referred to as the bonds of affection speech. And great speeches are almost all Martin Luther King Jr.'s great speeches have a title to them, a name. I hate to say it, but none of Hillary Clinton's speeches in the year she ran for president had any labels like that. It really is indicative of whether you had a message, what you were doing. All right. So on that note, now we time to set up our guest a little bit here. And today's theme we're going to dive into is what we talk about endlessly here, which is narrative is leadership. 3 years ago, I was invited by the World Bank to Nepal for a week with two retreats that they did. And this was the first one up in the Himalayas at this amazing resort. I didn't know any of the people there. And the first morning, I gave a talk to them about the ABT to this group. And this character right here began asking me some of the toughest questions I've ever gotten in a presentation, over and over again, raising his hand. And I was sitting there thinking in the back of my head, uh-oh, we've got a non-believer here, a skeptic. This guy by lunchtime is going to kick the legs out from under me, discredit me, and send me packing. But in fact, when I finished, he came up to me at lunch and he said, the reason I'm asking you these tough questions is I get this thing, this ABT. I instantly get it and I want to use it immediately. And I just want to know specifically, how does this thing work? And in fact, he did within a couple weeks after that. His name is John Roome. He's our guest with us here today. And this is what I found for the title. Maybe you want to fine tune for us your position these days with the World Bank when you come on. But here's what John immediately did was he set to work. He was a program director for Southeast Asia, and in each site visit, he would write a 2 minute, 1.5 to 2 minute ABT statement that he would then deliver in front of the camera. And for example, the first one, he said, "I'm here on the banks of the Jamuna River in Bangladesh, where the World Bank is involved with this and this, and we're doing some good things. And if we can manage to do this, then here's some of the benefits we'll get. But right now, we've got a problem with this, this, and this." And it just worked really well as a template. And each one of them he sent to us, and we put them on our website. It really was a great demonstration of the power of the ABT to just give focus to a large scale narrative of what's going on in a given place. And then 2 months ago, I was back in DC spending a week working further the folks at the World Bank and managed to have a chat with John. And he talked about how he's been using the ABT not just for communication, but really at a larger scale for basic leadership. He thinks it's a tool for leadership. And in fact, we've got with us that will join the discussion, Julie Clausen, who's one of our long-term members of this group, and she works a lot with the World Bank in Bhutan in particular on fisheries issues. And she's over the last 5 years organized 2 times the climate ambassador training program that we've done. And both times we've done it like 30 climate scientists doing fisheries work, and begin the year by training them in the ABT and finding that it's not just a communication tool, but also powerful for leadership. So on that note, I shall stop. And John, how's about if we start off just by, let me ask you, actually, just at the very basic levels, how many years you've been with the World Bank? How'd you get started? What you've been doing mostly over the years and your status now?
Thanks, Randy. Hi, everyone. So I was with the World Bank for 30. I left in June of last year. And so right now I'm doing advisory stuff, board stuff, some investing, some teaching. Those 35 years was mainly in Africa and in Asia in what we call sustainable development. So that's all of the infrastructure sectors, agriculture, environment, social, disaster change, disaster management, and climate change. A lot of that was in senior leadership positions, managing large programs, and in leading our climate change work. So there's the quick introduction.
And how about these days? What are you involved with?
So right now priority number one is to protect 15 weeks of the year for hiking, biking, running, started racing again. So that's and seeing friends and family. So that's number one priority. Then the rest is consulting and advisory work. I'm working with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to up their game on climate. I'm leading an Africa Green Economy Summit, doing some work on smallholder rubber, doing some teaching, uh, working with, I was a Rhodes Scholar, and so now I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Global Rhodes Scholarships, helping recruit and select new Rhodes Scholars. So there's a bunch of things I'm doing, talking to people about other things I'll do in the next little while. If it has an impact and it's fun, I'll do it.
And what about the long-term mission of the World Bank? Has it not been for decades the singular focus of ending world poverty? And is there not a shift taking place this year now of shifting more towards jobs as the mission and a change? Can you say a few things about um, the the changes that have taken place the last 6 months? You're sensing?
I'm probably not the one to talk about the last 6 months, but let me talk a little bit about context. So the World Bank started as an investment organization to reconstruct Europe after the Second World War. And it then evolved into an investment bank that invested in infrastructure in Africa, started dealing with more poverty issues, and sort of around the turn of the century, a little bit before, the mission was formulated as a world free of poverty. That then evolved into eliminating poverty and increasing shared prosperity, and then added to that on a sustainable planet, which is where the mission was up until maybe, I don't know, 18 months ago. Since then, as far as I know, the official mission hasn't changed, the mission statement, unless I'm sort of a little out of that loop. But there is a little bit of reasoning, as these things do over a period of time, with, as you said, Randy, a stronger focus on jobs. Not that the underlying mission, I think, has changed, but the idea is that if you want to eliminate poverty and if you want to increase shared prosperity, which basically means improve equality, you need to generate jobs. The sustainability piece of it has been a little bit tweaked. So it's a little bit more resilience than lower carbon. But I think these are political shifts that are taking place in the world and the institutions trying to adapt to that.
Okay, great. We've Matthew and Liz and I've done quite a bit of work now with the World Bank, and in the book that I've just written, one of the two big chapters is about what I call the plague of ands in the World Bank, and it's very well documented from that study that was done by the Stanford Literary Lab in 2015, what the language of bank speak is and the way that they have a tendency to communicate there. And I think it's a language of diplomacy. It's a little bit kind of dismissive to call it a plague of ands, but it's obligatory almost to use the word and, which is a word of agreement, a lot in diplomacy. And at the other end, so at one end of the spectrum, we have a ton of ands like that that ends up being a language that's somewhat impenetrable and has this nickname of bank speak. At the other end of the spectrum, we have almost non-diplomatic language, which is a certain politician who his narrative index is the only politician I've ever come across that routinely goes over 30, a score of 30. And that's just throwing away the word and just, saying but this, and just no interest in tact and diplomacy and things like that. The question is there a medium somewhere in between where we could push the World Bank to have basically what we've talked about as a diplomatic version of the ABT, where you're pushing for a little more focus, a little more use of contradiction, and yet you don't want to offend people. You took to the ABT that first day. Can you say a few thoughts about why did you take to it and what you see in terms of that dynamic of the presence of agreement and contradiction?
Um, so as we've spoken before, Randy, a few times, the reason I like the ABT is I actually see it as an important strategic leadership tool and not just as a mode of communication. And what I mean by that, the if you see lots of ands, and you don't see a strong but or a strong therefore, basically it means, in my mind, that you're not being strategic because strategy is about choice. And so often, I think when you see a rambling and speech, it often means that the speaker or the organization behind it is not very good at making hard choices. And so the one benefit I see of the ABT is this ability to nail things down to a smaller subset of issues and to have a way of communicating that then rallies your team members or your stakeholders around those issues. And to me, I see the ands to set up a platform to move to, the buts, the challenge that you need to leave, and the important piece then is the therefore, because you want to mobilize the action around that. And I see the other two as setting that up so that you can mobilize the support around the therefore. So then when you look at it within the World Bank, I think there's, following on from this, two elements to it. The one is, how does the bank move towards making more strategic choices? And communication is part of that, but there's a bunch of other leadership things that are important. The second thing is that the bank, sort of where I think maybe your question's coming from, Randy, is in a complex position. On the one hand, it's an executing development agency that tries to be efficient and get results. On the other hand, it is an expressly political body with a political, as you say, diplomatic authorizing environment. And so you can't entirely ignore that authorizing environment. And I think one of the reasons that you see all the ands is what you're seeing is public facing documents. And those public facing documents are sometimes used to try and bring a broad range of stakeholders around the table who don't always agree on everything. And so if you put all the ands in there, people see, okay, check, my issue has been marked. Therefore, I'm not going to throw a hissy fit and object to what's going on here because my objective is to just get recognition. It's a little bit like the echo chamber and the confirmation bias and all the rest of it. If you throw all those ands in, you get confirmation bias and everybody comes in. It doesn't help to make strategic choices, and it doesn't help to build the alignment around what you're going. But I think this is part of why you see so much of that and language and a little bit less of a willingness to push the and the
Hmm.
therefore. Certainly
Okay.
in outside facing communication.
Yeah, so in a minute I'm going to call on Julie to step in and start pushing things a bit. But you were there in 2017 when the whole flap happened with their chief economic officer who came in and tried to change the system, Paul Romer, and he sadly chose this word "and" as the focus of his efforts to change things, and the whole establishment there did not understand what in the world he was talking about. And I'm not sure he even understood. Did you hear anything about that when it was going on? Because, he left. There was a lot of other friction. And actually, I've talked to a couple other guys when I was there the last time, a couple months ago. And they gave me a little bit background perspective on it. But it was a very frustrating experience for everybody around and total confusion. None of it was about narrative structure. It was all about narrative structure when you look at it with our background of the ABT, but they didn't have that. And so it was just this outside report that showed that the word "and" was being used a lot, then him trying to bring it down to 2.6% frequency, and then everybody having a giant misunderstanding. Did you follow any of that when it took place?
Um, to be honest, not really. Because as you said, the issues around Roma had to do with a whole bunch of other things.
Yes.
There was some organizational power struggle, and there was some questioning of orthodoxy, and there was running up against tough messages for powerful interest groups.
But interestingly, the and flap was the only thing that made it into the media. And so the Economist wrote a whole article presenting the data of the graph of the proliferation of the word and they called it conjunction dysfunction. And it was a handle for them to present this one issue of which, yeah, as I understand, he was embroiled in a whole bunch of different things like that. But I've offered it up as a cautionary tale, which is don't try and change the system when everybody in the system doesn't know what in the world you're talking about with narrative structure in the ABT. And that's we've seen examples of it elsewhere where people learn the ABT with the best of intentions, go back to their group, their organization, and start trying to change things, and nobody knows what in the world they're talking about. And so that's what happened there, and that's my perception of that. You're smiling. What? Why are you smiling at
So,
that?
and I think we've touched on this before. I think in terms of trying to draw some lessons on the ABT, there is stuff that you can draw from this.
Yeah,
But I firmly believe that there were so many other complicated things going on with Paul Romer and
yeah.
other geopolitical things and political things going on in the organization that this wasn't the biggest deal. And this isn't what got the pushback. There were many other things that are, at least in my view, much deeper. And maybe they didn't make it into The Economist, but it made it into other political fora that were, I think, equally important and difficult. But I think but the core point I think comes to one can't look at this as simply a mechanistic communication narrative structure issue. It has to be aligned with the underlying leadership issues that you're dealing with behind it, and building.
Well, but this is where you and I might divide a bit on this because my take on it is that we are a media-driven society and have been for decades. And Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s began pointing this out. The society is being driven more and more by media. That's the only thing that drove in the public sphere what was going on with Paul Romer. And if that's all that emerges into the media world, that's most of what the people in the organization probably have to go on. And so, yeah, there may have been a lot of other things internally, but so we just differ on that because I
Yeah.
firmly believe we are a media-driven society. And as much as people like to think they're objectivists and pulling in all the data and everything like that, media dominates the thought process. It's what's going on in our society today.
So, yeah, so I would agree. It is media dominated. There's a lot of stuff that's got to be dealt with on the media. However, in the case of Roma, the reason he was forced out was not because of his position on the and. It was
Yes,
because of doing business reports. It was the fact that he wanted to run up against certain strong vested interests. He was not the most diplomatic in dealing with it. He might have been
right.
technically right, but he wasn't the most diplomatic in dealing with it, and he didn't build allies in order to take on those battles. And so that's why I think that as we think about how we communicate, how we think about narrative structure, the other supporting pieces have got to be put in place. So even if you simplify this down to narrative structure, he was not very good at building allies consistently around him
Mhm.
to understand fundamentally why is this important? Why do we need to make the choices? What does it look like? And how does the narrative structure fit into that? I think that's
Yeah, yeah.
that's the lesson I take from it.
Yeah, okay. And so let's see. First side comment, Doug Passon, and maybe you want to jump in a bit, but Doug is one of two lawyers that join us routinely and is a big fan of the ABT, and yet have both reported back that they can't get other lawyers in their law firms and groups to really take an interest and grasp it. So this is the cultural boundary that we run up against is trying to get people that don't have any narrative background and just think this is something silly. But for right now, Julie Clausen, how about it if you jump in and say a few things and thoughts about narrative is leadership, our favorite catchphrase.
Yes, yeah. And hi, John. Really, really nice to hear your comments. So I have worked for World Bank and IFC on the consultant side, and our frustration is we turn in a report and following the clear, concise, ABT report, and they'd go, "Well, it's not big enough." And it says, "Well, it says what it needs to say," and they're like, we need a lot more words, right? Like the culture was the bigger the
Wow.
report, the better the quality. And so fighting that culture was really interesting. And just adding words so it would look bigger and better was, we we had some big discussions on that. And as I worked more, I mean, there's the challenge of the cultural language issue, but also just the push for, and I hate to call it lazy, but that ethic that it's hard work to make things clear and concise, right? Simple is not easy. And um, I continue to find challenges with the people that we work with in these big international organizations on that sort of ethic of well, I don't know if it. I get the feeling that it's just too hard to write clear and concise. It's just easier to put a lot of words out, and that usually equals a lot of ands. So, do you find that as part of the issue?
So, so yes, so I think there's a number of things that resonate, and I can draw from things even before I had any idea of the ABT. So before I joined the World Bank, I was a corporate strategy consultant. And so we worked on presentations, and new consultants would make long, rambling presentations, okay? And they say, okay, what pieces of data do we have? And you put your data up, and you have a slide with data and a slide with data. And the story would go like this. And I quickly came to the thing that the most important thing that you could do was to have what we called the storyboard. So you'd put markers for the slides, and you would run the narrative story through that. So let's leave aside even the question of what the narrative structure is, but do you have a narrative and a story there? And I would find that once we had all the analytics done, I would have to spend days, literally days, many, many more than my colleagues did, in making sure that the presentation had a clear narrative structure that got to the conclusion that we needed to do. And you're right, it's easier. The irony is it's easier to write a long, rambling 20-page piece than a 5-page piece that's concise. So I think there's certainly that going on. I think it happens in all organizations. It's just harder to be clearer. I think that in the World Bank and institutions like that have got a more amorphous, harder to quantify objective, and multiple stakeholders with multiple objectives. Everybody wants to put things in. So the another analogy I use, we do these things called country strategy papers, which are supposed to be focused. And somebody once did a cartoon that they circulated in the bank. And so the first block of the cartoon it said a well-focused country strategy. And it had a target, a bullseye, with an arrow pointed directly at the center. The second frame said, after the first review, the targets were raised in this strategy. And so the bullseye goes to the top, and the arrow is now pointing forward, pointing upwards. And then the third one said, and then the reviewers added various pieces to it that had to be included in order to get this approved. And the upward pointing arrow with the target turned into a little ball on the top. The arrow turned into a Christmas tree, and it had all the bells and whistles on the Christmas tree. And they said, okay, this is how you go from a sharply focused strategy to bells and whistles on a Christmas tree that means everything to everybody. And so this is why I think that, so part of it is what you're talking about. It's easier to be long than short, but it also is this culture of saying, we've got to make some choices. We've got to be clear. And if we say yes to this, we say no to something else. And you've got a diplomatic community with a culture that doesn't handle conflict well. So unless you can handle and resolve that conflict, you're not going to get to the kind of choices that you need to make to have a narrative structure. And so you just can't push it. And so I don't know, Randy, so within my team, within that team that you came to, I try to spend a lot of time with them in the background on other stuff to try and get them to find ways to talk constructively to sort out these differences. Because if they couldn't agree on a well-structured narrative, it wasn't that they didn't understand what you were saying, Randy. A lot of it, I think, was much more fundamental, that either they didn't know how to make the choices, or if they made the choices and communicated that clearly, they would offend somebody else and they would have to go through the process of managing it. And so unless you can create that capability to make the choice and then manage the conflict constructively that comes out of it, you're going to spin.
Yeah. Hey, Karen, do you want to say what you were typing in there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just a really important point that the clarity comes from hard choices and the conflict resolution that we aren't good at, as especially West Coasters over here. But I think Americans in general, if we encounter conflict, we just kind of make it into huge drama, which never resolves it, or pretend it doesn't exist. And like, oh, let's be nice.
Well, and woven into that is the basic pattern of going from order to entropy. And that's a part of what I see in that graph from the Stanford Literary Lab study of the proliferation of the word and, was that in the beginning in 1946, the frequency of and in the annual reports was 2.6%, which reflects a great deal of order and structure. They didn't have the narrative index in there, but I guarantee you it would have correlated right along, inversely correlated. And by the 2015, the frequency of use of and had doubled to 5%, from 2.5% to 5%. And that's, I think, largely reflective of moving in that direction towards more and more entropy and less kind of constraints to try and find order in it. Along the way, in your years with the World Bank, did you see anybody come in who tried to fight the tide on that and say, we've got to get more efficient, we've got to make some of these things shorter, more focused, anything like that? Or is it just been a constant drift towards, as I say, entropy, John?
The World Bank is a big, complicated organization. And so one of the reasons I managed to stay there for 35 years is I could move around into areas where I could control and shape my life and environment in ways that obviously were constrained or enabled by the organization, but didn't have to fully align with it. So what I mean by this is that at the organizational level, I think as the World Bank has dealt with a much more complicated geopolitical environment, a broader range of objectives and a range of things that lots of different people want, this has made it much more difficult to be focused and to make choices. Some leaders have come in and tried to put a focus on strategy. Jim Wolfenson tried to do that. But all he did largely was to create an overarching framework that threw all of the stuff into an inclusive framework, which helped a little bit at the understanding, but it didn't really help with the choice. And so it's no surprise that things proliferated as a result of it. Some of the others have come in and said, this is a fool's journey to try and make these choices. I'm not even going to do it. I'm just going to do a few things myself and have it. And now, having said that, within the organization, certain directors, vice presidents, managers have been able to be more focused, more concise, and to drive that agenda. It's not disseminated as a cultural norm now across the organization, but there are some country teams that have been able to do it, some sectoral teams that have been able to do it better than others. It's not clear to me that those who do that are well rewarded. Because here's the dilemma, because you might be able to be clearer, you might be able to get better impact, you might be able to align your team better, but as I said earlier, you're going to piss people off as you do it. Now, you can manage that, you can do it a bit better, but we have internal 360-degree feedback. So all of your peer managers, all of your clients, all of your staff provide you with 360-degree feedback, okay? Because of the way the averages work, if you've got a team of 15 people that you're working with, and you royally piss off 2 or 3 of them because you want to cut what they're doing, they're going to give you ones on that rating, and that will pull your averages down so that you end up in the bottom 20% of performance on your 360 feedback. And so on the one hand, it's good to try and get the feedback. On the other hand, in a vain attempt to quantify it, it's created this bizarre framework that if you are essentially a country club manager, you're going to get better. Country club manager is somebody who just wants to please anybody as opposed to getting results.
Facilitator.
Yeah, if you're a country club manager, you're going to get better 360-degree feedback results. And the reason this persists is that in the World Bank, to show true results on the ground, you can't do it on a year-to-year basis. I can get lending out, I can manage my budget, I can manage my people, but you're not going to see climate resilience or huge impacts in reduced transport times year to year. And that just gets pushed so far out with so much stuff that becomes a weaker part of the focus. And sorry, I'm diversifying.
No. This is really good.
And I'm sure that other organizations are just as complicated in their own.
Well, let's hear from somebody who's worked with an enormous organization, the American Association of Advanced Science, Shirley Malcolm. Shirley, you just put a comment there. You want to share that with us? Are you there, Shirley? Muted. While we're waiting for Shirley, Julie, did you want to say some more things about narrative as leadership?
Yeah, and I think just what John said. I mean, what's sort of ironic is that it's hard, but actually once you learn and have some intuition about the ABT, that then it becomes easier, right? I think it becomes more efficient. I think if you can get staff, if you can get your team, if you can get, people that are in meetings to buy in, way up. And I think that is, that is what leaders can do for their organization is to show that, this efficiency and that we can all work and understand each other better. One thing that, the other thing about leadership that fascinates me is just the Dubjansky, how you can have a room of people and ask them to do a Dubjansky, and then everybody has a different word, right? And so then, really understanding the why. And this is a challenge that we had in Bhutan with our colleagues, because we came in as viewed as adversaries, right? Where the fisheries people were fighting against hydropower and dam development. And that really wasn't true. We were fighting for balance. And so we were constantly referring back to our Dubjansky of nothing in hydropower, really made sense except in balancing the needs of the environment and balancing the needs of people. So that's the other point, is really having leaders understand what your theme is and getting everybody else on your team to understand what that is.
So Shirley, are you got?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm at an airport.
Oh, no problem.
So, what I put in the chat, I think, is the thing that we keep forgetting. And that is that the system is the unit for change. And that means that you've got to align all of the elements within it. As long as you're taking them one at a time, they can basically come into conflict with each other. And the elements aren't the really important thing in a system. The important thing in a system are the connections. And we forget that. The things that hold the pieces together. And if you can help people see the connections, they will see their stuff within it.
Karen, you wanted to second that with a bunch of hearts? I saw that. Matthew, you want to call on some other folks that are making comments?
Oh, sure. Doug, you had something to say earlier about infiltrating law school, as I recall. I'll go ahead and throw the spotlight to you.
Oh, well, I put it in the chat, so you didn't have to hear me talk again this week, but it's
No, no,
just a
no, go
big.
for it.
And I was reading all these chats and I'm seeing these great mantras that we've internalized, like the power of storytelling rests in the specifics. And I'm starting to think we're in a cult in the very best way that we've just got this. But the question Randy threw out earlier was why are lawyers resistant to this? And I just think that A, we're taught wrong in law school, and B, the farther we go in this practice, the bigger of a head we get, and the more we think we know, and the less open we are to change and learning new things. And so fundamentally, that barrier is the distinction between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. You're either open to learning a better way or you're not. And if you're not, there's not a whole lot I can do with you. But I think the solution is we can get them young and really just change the culture of the law school and get ABT ingrained in the way. Because all these young lawyers take legal writing classes, some take trial advocacy classes, and they never give us an actionable narrative template. They don't even talk much about narrative. They talk about issue, rule, application, conclusion. It's very analytical, that science mind that we're trying to overcome. So, and it's the whole thing that attracted me to the ABT in the first place, because there's so much of an overlap between the science brain and the legal brain. We got to get them young.
There definitely is, and we're constantly scrutinizing ourselves. Is this a cult group that we're on? But no, we're spreading so widely, and
I
one
meant
of the
it as
role
a
models.
compliment.
No,
I
no,
mean,
no.
I've fully drank Kool-Aid
Well,
and I'm
it's same
still
with me.
here.
I mean, the whole reason I open with that example of the ABT structure right there in Viktor Frankl's book is that every day I'm questioning, doubting myself. Is this just a little myopia thing? But one really good role model we've got for what you're talking about there is Emory University Medical School. We began teaching the ABT course there. This fall will be our fourth year in a row, and they're in love with it, infatuated with it. They had some little workshop a month ago where the faculty associated with the course proudly gave a panel discussion about how proud they are of this ABT course, and yet trying to propagate it beyond there is just so difficult. You just it's what I've talked about in the new book. I've called it the non-narrative conundrum, that everybody lives their lives in the default state of non-narrative all day long. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. People don't shape ABT in their brain. That's what the Lincoln Douglas debate is about. Is that Douglas won the live audience's hearts just by going so fast and just being and like that. ABT is tough, but it is the pathway forward, and we see that. It's just hard to propagate it. So yeah, Matthew, is somebody gonna call in there?
Oh, just a quick comment that Karen made about the cult-like status. We should be worried when Randy starts assigning us marriage partners, but until then, I think we're okay. Um,
At Shea Stadium.
Michael Rayner, you had something to add. I'll throw the spotlight to you.
Yeah, I don't know about add, but at least ask a question, which is when I've introduced this to folks and there's kind of an allergic reaction for many of the same reasons that have been adduced here. The reasons that I suppose are perhaps intensely personal, but fundamentally universal, right? Which is that, oh, lawyers aren't trained this way, oh, scientists aren't trained this way, oh, because everybody's not trained this way. And I think the resistance all comes from the same place. But one of the things that I found helpful, and this actually harkens back to a conversation we had, Randy, many years ago, is that ABT is very helpful. At a minimum, it's very helpful in communicating what you have to say, even if you use a very different structure to generate what you have to say. So the process that was described for lawyers around issue, I can't remember exactly what the three parts of that approach were. That may in fact remain entirely the most efficient way to come up and to generate what it is you're trying to communicate. But ABT is powerful in figuring out how to organize your own thinking, either as a way to communicate it to others, or at least just to communicate it to yourself effectively. And I found that helpful in overcoming some of the initial resistance.
Well, John, what are your thoughts going back to the very start there about narrative as leadership? And you'd said in your work with Asian Investment Bank, you've been using it for leadership exercises. Can you share a little bit of that experience?
Let me rather do a different example from this work that I'm doing with smallholder rubber. So by way of context, there's 6 million smallholder rubber farmers around the world who live very tough lives. They sell this natural rubber to processors and traders, who then sell it to tire manufacturers. Tire manufacturers are concerned about the political fallout from dealing with the smallholders that chop down forests or have poor social contract, social behavior, social protection issues. And so the question is, can we create a fund that the tire manufacturers will put into place in order to support these smallholders? So that's the sort of the framing. And so trying to get essentially an ABT structure to try and pull these different stakeholders together that's inclusive of the different stakeholder views. Because right now, the tire manufacturers are only worried about getting into trouble with the European regulators. The smallholders only want to get better impact. The environmentalists only want to be able to ensure that the forests don't get chopped down. And so there's no rallying storyline around which they can coalesce in order to work together. And so we're trying to develop essentially an ABT structure that basically says, let me see if I can get this right. Smallholders have a very rough life and are engaged in practices that are environmentally destructive. And the industry would rather improve that as well and are doing things to make this happen. But each stakeholder operating from their own individual interests is not allowing them to work together to deliver on what could be done. Therefore, what we need is a stronger coalition that works together, where each partner provides financing and impact on the ground in order to collaborate rather than acting individually. So I'm still trying to work this through. But if
that's tremendous. That's tremendous.
we could
Matthew, how do you score that, Matthew, for an ABT?
Oh, that's like 8 out of 10 at least. Yeah,
Yeah,
could use another revision or two, but that was fantastic.
Yeah, but again, here where I see the issues, I think that each of the stakeholders has their own view of the world. And if I can find an ABT narrative structure and use your concept of nesting, because I've got to figure out how to do the nesting underneath it. Okay, but if I can do that with a narrative structure that allows the tire manufacturers and the car manufacturers and the regulators and the government to recognize an integrated story, so that the tire manufacturers will put up $50 million up front as a starting. The smallholders will come together and say, this is what we need. The government will say, if we work together, we can help facilitate this and the NGOs can support it. And if all of this works together, we can scale it up over a period of time. And in 15 years, we can have a fully sustainable small rubber industry where the tire manufacturers get what they want, the governments get what they want, and the smallholders get what they want. And to try and use that as then the base and then break the therefore down into the steps that are needed over a period of time.
Man, that is a model of what the ABT brings, is this analytical approach to some extent of grabbing onto single elements that you're trying to get refined and at least build towards something, as opposed to hour-long discussions that go nowhere. People talk in circles endlessly. We're at the 10-minute warning. And Julie, did you want to add something to that? I saw you making a comment there.
Well, I was just saying you need a unifying Dobzhansky, John, to pull
Yes.
everybody together, yeah. But I wanted to make a comment on something Doug said about, you have to want a better way. And with some of our most recent groups, and they've been more early career, they are hungry for a better way. In January, Matt and Randy worked with a group of fellows that we had working on policy. And We just did a program review. We got doged, but we still did our program review. And hands down, what was your favorite part? What part resonated? What part is going to stick with you as you move on? You know, ABT 100% was in everybody's choice. And we see that over and over again with our groups. But they are truly hungry because they see the failures. They see that you know, the way that we've handled climate change or anti-science or real things that are happening in our world that we've got to change. And so I see the ABT as a big answer to that hunger. They just want to know how to make a better world. And
You know, one of the great experiments we got ongoing right now is with the FAA and their Aviation Research Center in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I went out there in March and gave a talk to 110 of them. And then we launched every Wednesday now. We do, well, we just moved to Tuesday, but once a week we do a narrative gym hour with them. And each week it's somebody's ABT. And yesterday was the next session, and they get about 20 to 25 people for those sessions. And it's tremendous. And they're learning it. We're getting there. We're moving the needle. We're establishing narrative culture within their core group. Although it's really driven by 5 or 6 kind of pioneers that are interpreters and propagating it that way. But exactly, I mean, we're making progress of this despite the non-narrative landscape that you are up against. Matthew, somebody else to comment here in the last? Oh, hey, Charles. Hey, how you doing, Charles?
Good, thank you.
Great.
I wanted to commenting on why it's so hard to spread these concepts, right, to different groups. And back to something Shirley said last week is who is the audience? And in this case, you have these different groups and they have different agendas. And there's a cosmic ABT concept, which I think is trying to make people care, but there's different languages that are used. And if you come to a group of academics who want to give conference talks that are interesting, and your assumption is that they are movie makers that want to put butts in seats, or you come to the World Bank who has a certain way they need to communicate to, and you assume that they are politicians who want to persuade people to vote a certain way, then you're going to be using the wrong set of words, the wrong flavor of ABT, if you like. And you'll say, well, do but. And they'll say, no, I need to say however, because I don't want to be this confrontation or whatever. The key point is it won't be the right flavor and they will therefore reject it. So
it's not a very happy message.
Well, the challenge is, I mean, ABT can work really well, but each subgroup has their own flavor that they'll respond to. And therefore, when talking about the ABT to a certain subgroup, we need to understand what is the flavor they're amenable to and what flavor of ABT should be presented.
Well, absolutely. And the term I use is the internal culture of an organization. Mm-hmm. And I ran up against that with a huge biotech firm that brought me in to try and improve their job promotion talks. And I worked with them for 2 years. And then a year later, checked in with the boss there. And basically, the jungle went and reclaimed everything there. They were and talks when I got there because they had a culture that consisted of impressing everybody in your first minute with how much you know. And I tried to explain that's not narrative. You know, you want to bring them in slowly and build to the deep end of the pool. And we redid a bunch of their talks and they were great. But, you know, a year after I was gone, the guy said, it's such a macho culture here that if you don't start with your first slide having 6 graphs on it, everybody will assume that you're incompetent and you'll have a disaster. So when you run up against exactly what you're saying, you can call it a flavor. I call it the culture of the place, but we tell that to a lot of people. Make sure you know what your home institution's culture is before you start trying to propagate this. That's a lot of the landscape. In the final 4 minutes here, John, what are you involved with for the near future, and where else do you see ABT?
Randy, can I just raise one issue because I gotta walk away, and that is that most smallholders are women, and the culture between the women who are smallholders and the tire people could not be bigger.
John, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that one dimension of it. There are other others as well, but there are a number of the, and so what I think we want to try and do is to have a narrative that allows each group to see what they're doing and the benefits of working together in this more collaborative platform. So I think just to come back to just a couple of things that were said. One was, I think that, and I know some people don't like this analogy, but if you want some change to happen in an organization that involves deeply held beliefs and culture, they've got to understand that they're sitting on a burning platform. And if they continue with business as usual, it's not going to give them the results that they want. And you've then got to set aside what a different platform to jump to looks like. The second thing is that I think that it's very difficult to communicate ABT or even narrative structure or even storytelling as an intellectual concept. People will nod, but they don't get it. You actually have to experience it. And so part of where I've come from in this journey was I started by recognizing the power of just general storytelling. Because I would go to various meetings and somebody would stand up and give a speech with all the right analytic structure, and people would yawn and they wouldn't know what would happen. But if I tell the story of the woman that was affected by the floods in Pakistan, and she lost everything, and the floods affected her, and the response was multisectoral, and she got title to her land, and blah, all this stuff came together, blah, blah, blah. Just by telling that story, people would walk away and understand. And understanding that at a gut level, how it works, is what allows people to adopt these new approaches. It's exactly the same, I find, or there's an analogy with the personality profile tests. So you've got Myers-Briggs, you've got DISC, you've got all of these things. If you just go in and tell people you've got to do it, and here's the theory for why you need to do something along these lines, you're going to get pushback, you're going to get allergic reaction. If people have seen that by actually doing this, it helps them perform better for the objectives that they want, and they experientially understand this. That's what creates the champions that allows you to, you can't drive it analytically and push it through.
Well, that's the divide, experiential versus intellectual. And that explains why you took to the ABT so quickly. And that also brings us to the end of our excellent hour. And thank you so much, John. We have to wrap this up. We got to go on to a next session. But everybody come back next week. We'll have another one of these great discussions. They are so much fun. Yay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Bye.
Join us again soon. Okay. Bye-bye.